Good evening, all, and welcome to the second in the Summer Archives series of 2022. So we are so glad that you all are joining us, and we have a very big treat tonight. Samantha Lucas grew up at St. David's Church and went away for college and jobs, and then is back in the area. And she moved into a very historic property and began to do historical research on her own house and property, and found some very interesting connections to the Episcopal Church, in fact. And then a serendipitous meeting in the Good News Community Garden introduced Samantha and me to one another as Molly Zonino yelled across the garden, "Samantha's doing historical research!" as the archives was considering, how do we begin to tell the story about enslaved peoples and the institution of slavery and its connection to St. David's, as that story has not yet been told. So Samantha was eager to look into this project, and we're very grateful for the relationships that have developed in the archives over this last year. And this is just sort of a starting place into this research. So it is not the end of the story by any means, but only just the beginning. So this talk is entitled "A Look into the Past, Remembering African American Church History" at St. David's. And Samantha is a graduate of the University of Vermont, a very good amateur historian, and a captain in the U.S. Army, and a helicopter pilot. And very, very talented in many ways. So we are very much looking forward to your talk, and there will be time for conversation and questions at the end. So please join me in welcoming Samantha.
All right, thank you all for coming tonight. I'm really excited to be here presenting to you all, and thanks for the kind introduction, Reverend Emily. So it was a little over a year ago that I started on this project. So I've been doing research as it relates to this for a year here. And there are times when it's really exciting, as with all historical research, and there are times when it's quite disappointing because in the past there's often gaps. So we're gonna just get right into it. Why are we here? Why are we even doing this presentation? Well, first I'm gonna apologize because I am gonna read this word for word because it's important. It's not the whole thing, but in 2006, at the General Convention for the Episcopal Church, a resolution was passed. And here are some snippets from that resolution. Quote, "The institution of slavery was and is a sin and a fundamental betrayal of the humanity of all persons who were involved." End quote. Quote, "Acknowledge our history of participation in this sin and the deep and lasting injury." End quote. Quote, "Urge every diocese to collect and document during the next triennium detailed information in its community on A, the complicity of the Episcopal Church in the institution of slavery, and in the subsequent history of segregation and discrimination, and B, the economic benefits the Episcopal Church derived from the institution of slavery." End quote. And then, quote, "How the church can be, quote, the repairer of the breach," from Isaiah 58:12, "both materially and relationally, and achieve the spiritual healing and reconciliation that will lead us to new life in Christ." End quote. So this isn't just a local thing here. It is really driven from the entire Episcopal Church. This was put out and really directed that everyone be doing this research. And as we know, being one of the oldest churches in the area, this is a story we have to tell. It's one we have to look into and bring to light that we haven't yet. So as a greater church, we've identified all of this as fact because it is true. All of us in this room have benefited from being a part of this community here at St. David's, and so because of that, we've also benefited from slavery. This is a big and important undertaking. It can seem really overwhelming and insurmountable. How do we go about this? But in cases like that, as in all situations in life where we face those things, we have to break it down and just take one step at a time and not look at the biggest picture, but look at what can we do right now to move this forward and keep working on it. So I hope tonight sparks interest in understanding this part of our history, promotes meaningful conversations that are driven by empathy and seek reconciliation, and gives our parish a better foundational knowledge for which to use moving forward as we seek to be those repairers of the breach. All right, topics of conversation. We're going to go over a brief timeline just to give everyone a frame of reference and contextualize some of this conversation. Then we're going to look at, very briefly overview, what life was like for African Americans in Pennsylvania in the 1700s and 1800s. What about St. David's? What was going on here during that time frame in a generic sense? And then we're going to look at two individuals and one family. So we'll look specifically at Reverend William Curry, who was an early missionary here at St. David's, Judge William Moore, who was a prominent member of the church as well as very active in the greater Pennsylvania community, and then the Adams family, which is an African American family that was at the church in the 1800s. Then I have a slide that's on some recent media clips. We're not going to look at them, but they're just there for reference to show that other work is going on and hopefully will be made available when the talk is posted. And then further work. So where do we go from here now that we've done this one small step? What else can we do moving forward? What is left to do? And then we're going to close out with a moment of remembrance. All right, timeline. So the greater timeline of this story really starts in 1638, which is even before the church. And that's when they estimate that the first enslaved Africans arrived in what would become Pennsylvania. They were working generally with trapping in the fur business in conjunction with the Dutch West India Company that was here at that time. In 1681, the King of England signs over the land of Pennsylvania, well, what was to be named Pennsylvania, to William Penn to pay off a debt from William Penn's, that the king had to William Penn's father. As early as 1700, there are missionaries from the Church of England that are preaching to individuals in the area. So these missionaries are connected to an organization called Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. Instead of saying that every time, I'm going to refer to them as SPG because it's quicker. And so these missionaries in the very beginning were mostly located in Philadelphia, the main port, and they would come out and service these areas and other areas as well. So it's not like they were here every single Sunday conducting church as we know it today, but they were really the only connection to the church that the people had at the time and the early foundations of what did become St. David's as a parish. Then in 1715, the cornerstone was laid for our old church across the street. So now we have an actual physical presence here. In the 1740s, we know that some Episcopal churches in the area, including St. David's, allowed African Americans to attend in some capacity, as well as Episcopal churches in the city of Philadelphia. It was most likely both enslaved and free African Americans at the time. In 1761, we have a report from Reverend Curry back to SPG in which he talks about the African American population in the area. In 1780, we have the Pennsylvania Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. This is post-Revolutionary War now, so the United States has been founded, and Pennsylvania is one of the first states to put into law an abolition-type law. However, it was really conservative. So while it is a good step, it didn't really do too much. What it did was for children that were born to enslaved individuals, they were still enslaved up until the age of 28. So even though it was enacted in 1780, it didn't really have concrete effects until much later. The African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas is founded by Absalom Jones in 1794. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this right now because I won't touch on it again in the presentation, but it is an important part of the African American Episcopal story in the area. So Absalom Jones was born as an enslaved person in Delaware. His owner moved him to Philadelphia, where he was then allowed to attend school, church, and marry. He ended up buying his wife's freedom and was eventually manumitted after multiple requests in 1784. He wanted to create a place of worship for African Americans, and so he started a church, and there was a big question about whether they were going to affiliate or not. There are a lot of different denominations that were active at the time, And ultimately, he chose that he was going to affiliate the church and that it would be with the Episcopal Church, because the Episcopal Church had opened their doors to African Americans at that time and let them come in and worship. So he chose to affiliate with them. In 1863, you have the Emancipation Proclamation, which I'm sure, as we all know, didn't actually also end slavery, but it was really a military measure that only freed enslaved men and women that were in the states that had seceded from the Union. But it did not impact those that were in Union-controlled areas down there, as well as the loyal border states. And then finally, in 1865, we have the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, which is outlawing slavery across the nation. It is also not until 1865 that DIAPA, the Diocese as a whole of Pennsylvania, adopted a resolution calling for, quote, or for an end to, quote, oppression and slavery in all its forms, end quote. So even though we have St. Thomas, which became an Episcopal church in 1794, and then later Absalom Jones also started Church of the Crucifixion in Philadelphia, they were not allowed to actually fully participate as churches in our diocese until 1865. So it's almost 70 years later, long time. So there's our whole timeline together. It's by no means comprehensive of all the important facts, but I just wanted to, again, put a frame of reference for this conversation for those that aren't intimately familiar with what was happening at the times. All right, so what was life like for African Americans in Pennsylvania in the 1700s and 1800s? Well, we had both free and enslaved African Americans. So Pennsylvania was this unique kind of mixing area where you had both living in the same place at the same time, which must have been extraordinarily challenging for many people to have that dichotomy existing. Most of the free African Americans were probably located in Philadelphia. There weren't probably as many out here in the suburbs. And it was estimated in Pennsylvania that the highest number of enslaved individuals reached all the way up to 30,000 in 1766. The enslaved men and women of the area generally worked as domestic servants if they were females, on farms, ironworks, and shipbuilding for the males. And the population varied quite a bit. A lot of it was tied to the economics of the area. So in the very beginning, while there were slaves in the north, there were also considerably less compared to southern states because it was more economic to actually use indentured servants. So you also have a big community of indentured servants that existed in Pennsylvania. Then they were coming over from Europe, so a lot of individuals from Ireland and Germany. But then the French and Indian War in 1754 considerably slowed down immigration from Europe and thus the influx of indentured servants, and this just drove up demand for enslaved individuals. So people stopped paying for indentured servants and started purchasing enslaved men and women instead to fill that gap. However, as America got closer to the Revolution, sentiments of many did change. People were grappling with the idea of how can I own an individual while I'm fighting to not be owned by England? And so you see an increase of manumissions at that time, and that's really when things change a little bit more to the morality side and less of the economic side, but both still existed at that time. Enslaved individuals helped their owners profit directly by their own free labor, so that one's pretty obvious. If you're not paying someone for the work they're doing, you are benefiting from that quite literally. But we also have the indirect benefit of slavery as an industry as a whole in the area. Wheat was a huge thing back then in the agricultural aspect of Pennsylvania. But what people often don't know is that most of that wheat was actually sent to feed the enslaved individuals who were working down in the islands in the triangle trade. So even if individuals here didn't directly own enslaved men and women themselves, if they were in those types of industries, they still very much benefited from slavery as an institution. So what about St. David's? First off is, how do we determine who was in the parish of St. David's? How do we determine who St. David's was, essentially? Because as we know, the church is a people and not a place or a thing. And that can be hard. Many records don't exist. Some records are really hard to access. They're locked away. You have to order one box at a time and then go through hand by hand and hope that something relates to what you're looking at. And it requires a lot of hours and research. You have primary source documents, you have secondary source documents. So the secondary source ones, you're trying to verify, find other sources that confirm that information. So it's a lot. For this project, it was something I struggled with. I said, okay, great, I'm gonna do this research. Well, where's a list of everyone that was in St. David's at that time? There isn't one, so we had to get a little creative. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the history of Old St. David's Church at Radnor, PA by Henry Pleasance. And in the back of his book, he has a bunch of appendices, and they list individuals, internments from individuals during the time. He also lists a couple lists of communicants from records that he had found, attendance at special events, and petitions that related to the church, just to name a few of the things that he included in there. It's not comprehensive by any means, it's probably missing a lot, but it was definitely the most accessible, and it provided a lot to work with. So that's where we started off. And it may sound like one book to those who aren't familiar, but it's actually 2 books and a corrections pamphlet. So you can't just look at one, because you're not going to have the whole story. So I spent hours and hours cross-referencing all 3 and digitizing the records of those individuals. And I ended up with a list of 1,442 individuals. So now this is what I'm looking at. Were any of these individuals ones that were a part of slavery? Were they involved in it? Did they own enslaved individuals? That's what we need to find out. Now, the most comprehensive records in terms of slavery in the area and for where we're at are the Chester County Servant and Slavery records. So I have about 5 different records that they've compiled specifically as it relates to slavery. And when I cross-referenced my 2 lists, so looking at the slavery records and then looking at the list of individuals that were involved in St. David's, 2 things became very clear right from the start. First is members of our clergy and parish owned enslaved people. And it's over 40 potentially who did own enslaved people that were connected to St. David's. So 40 that we maybe know of out of 1,442. So it is a smaller population, but this is a snippet and it's not the whole story, and there's still a lot more work to do. So we still, don't know about the industry of all the people that were involved at that time, and there could potentially be more that just fell through the cracks of these 2 lists. But that's still a ton. It's a lot to work with and look into. So a couple other things we know about St. David's. I mentioned earlier that we did have African Americans at the church early on. So Reverend Robert Wayman was a missionary from SPG. He serviced St. David's from 1719 to 1730. In a letter back to SPG, he stated that he was trying to get families to bring their enslaved men and women here to the church, and that it was extremely challenging, and in fact, he was only successful with one family. That was in 1728. A few years later, he wrote to SPG again in one of his reports that he was, quote, preparing blacks for baptism, end quote. So we do know that there was some involvement. It's hard to quantify exactly what it was, and really no naming. So just numbers and ideas and not concrete individuals, which is really kind of what we're trying to get at here. In 1761, so we're about 30 years later now, Reverend Curry is the missionary for the area, and he sends a report to SPG. And in all the reports, they would generally talk about who was around in the parish. I apologize, it's small. I'll try and read what's on there so you guys get the context. But here's a snippet. It's actually a transcription of the report. The reports are all in England, where they're maintained. So this is, I believe it was in 1900-ish when someone asked for a copy of some of these records. And so this is a typewritten copy that we have up here in the archives. And there's a bunch of these, and this is the only one that specifically calls out African Americans. So he's talking about the number of inhabitants in the area are 2,000, baptized in the last half year, 90, and 1 adult Negro. This is one of the first and maybe only mentions of African Americans that we have from Reverend Curry directly. Also further down, you'll see it's enumerated 50 Negroes being in the area next to the word heathens. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We're not really sure what exactly this is. Were these individuals part of the church? Were they attending? Were they not? Were they just locally in the area? We're not entirely sure. He doesn't specify that out for us other than marking them separately. And then all the other reports only say the word heathens and then have a number. So again, it doesn't directly say that he is referring to African Americans or enslaved individuals as heathens, but one might infer that that is what he's doing in the later reports. Again, this is the only one that specifically marks out African Americans. All right, so we'll continue talking about Reverend Curry. He was a missionary at St. David's from 1737 to 1776. He also serviced the area a bit after the Revolutionary War, but he maintained true to the king, essentially, and so that's what terminated his service originally, but then there was a gap, and so he helped fill in some places later on. As we just talked about from the last slide, we know he baptized at least one African American. We can presume that they were probably a free African American, but again, we don't know for sure. In 1765, he paid taxes on 2 enslaved individuals, and then in 1777, he was only paying taxes on 1. So that gives us some time reference for the enslaved men and women that Reverend Curry himself owned. And we also, there's an ad that I have up here, but there's also another known ad for an additional 2 enslaved men and 1 enslaved woman who were unnamed. So we know that he owned enslaved people, as mentioned, and that he sold them. Here we'll see their names listed out in the ad. You have Glasgow, Quaco, Deb and her child, and Moll and her boy. Reverend Curry's participation in the institution of slavery and owning enslaved individuals is important because he was the religious figurehead of our church at that time. He's the person that people looked up to for all things as it related to morality and religion. And so if he is owning enslaved individuals, that's a big speak to the community and where the time was at the time, or what everyone's sentiments were at the time, for being okay with that, I guess, and accepting it. Despite also the narrative from Reverend Wayman, who was prior to Reverend Curry's times, regarding about trying to educate and baptize and have African Americans participating in the church, we really don't see any of that with the records from Reverend Curry. So unsure if he was doing it or not, but there's no record of it, whereas with Reverend Wayman, there was a concrete records that he was trying at least to encourage families to bring in the enslaved men and women to be baptized. SPG back in England were proponents of baptizing enslaved men and women. They encouraged their missionaries to work with the families that all up and down the United States to do that. Other states were facing similar issues in which individuals did not want to bring in the enslaved men and women to the church and get them baptized and provide them with those services. And we know from some of their letters back and forth to SPG that it was a pretty constant point of discussion and asking SPG essentially to back them up and provide some more concrete information that they could pass on. One of the concerns that was voiced from owning families was that they were concerned that baptism would be construed with freedom, and that is why they didn't want the enslaved men and women to be baptized. And so SPG actually wrote a bill to reinstate that from their perspective that it was separate, and still encouraging people to bring those individuals in. All right, so now to talk about Judge William Moore. For those of you that don't know, he was a very prominent figure in Pennsylvania. He was a judge, a politician, a state legislator. He served as both the president and vice president of Pennsylvania. That's now called the governor and lieutenant governor. He was a state legislator. I already said that one. He was the director of the Bank of Pennsylvania and also a trustee at UPenn. Additionally, he was also pretty engaged here at the church, serving on the vestry 2 separate times, and was listed in other events as well in the appendices of the Pleasance book. Additionally, the Moore family is a pretty large family in and of themselves. There were 40 individuals in my records who carried the last name of Moore, and they were, I believe, the highest reoccurrence of a last name that I saw amongst the records. So they were definitely very much involved and engaged in church life here at St. David's. I am inclined, though, to say that I think there are 2 separate Moore families. I couldn't verify that for certain in my genealogy work, again, because the records can be hard. But there were also 2 other Moore individuals, so they may or may not be related to Judge Moore, who came up as also having owned enslaved individuals. So they could also be connected, but we're just going to focus on Judge Moore himself. On the right of the screen, you'll see a copy of the 1780 Chester County Slave Register, and you see William Moore's name at the top, and below is a list of 10 individuals. Some of them have a brief description that he owned at the time of the slave register. We also know that Judge Moore put out many ads for runaway slaves, and we have a couple here that I was able to pull. So based on just these few records, we know that Judge Moore owned at least 11 individuals. There's the one ad on the bottom here. The individual is named as Jack, and that doesn't match any of the other 10 names on the slave registrar, so we know that they were separate individuals. Oftentimes, though, the enslaved men or women are not named in these types of records. Okay, so now to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Adams family. Now we're going to move forward to about mid-1800s. The Adams family is the only other family listed, or individuals that are listed in the Pleasance book, as being identified as African American other than Moses Mayhew, who the Archives has done some work on, so if you're not familiar with him, I encourage you to look that information up. So that's pretty distinctive and stuck out to me when I was collecting all of this information for my research, and I wanted to make sure we told their story as well. So the main connecting point for the entire Adams family is a woman by the name of Chloe Adams, and that's because she appeared twice in our St. David's records. The first time is having been on a list of communicants of St. David's in 1845. So that's the top 2 photos you'll see on the screen, and you'll see her name. It says Chloe Adams, and then in parentheses it says colored. We also have internment records from the Adams family. That's there on the bottom. So you have Chloe, George, who was Chloe's brother, and he passed away at 17 years. Harriet, who is indicated as being the daughter of Chloe, and Jacob, presumably her husband. And then Mary Ann, also a daughter, indicated to be from Chloe and Jacob. And they're all indicated as being African American and being in unmarked graves in the cemetery. So it's unknown how they came to be at St. David's. I wasn't able to find that in my research, but we do know that they were here, and we have pretty good evidence of that, and that's important to tell. So while the records in the Pleasance book are good because it allowed us to uncover this part of the story, they don't really give us tons of information to work with, especially when you look at the other records in the books that have dates, ages, relationships, parents, for all of these other internments. So we're really working with not a ton here. One of the things that we can infer, though, from just the Pleasance book records is that Chloe was most likely a young adult by 1845 when she was listed as a communicant at the church, and it doesn't appear as though she was with any other personal relations, so you could also probably infer that she is a free African American woman who went to that event. All right, so on to state records now. So I continue to look up the Adams family, seeing what else I could uncover about their story in the area. That was all I had, essentially, from our church records that I could find, and so I went elsewhere. While I wasn't able to find any marriage records, I couldn't find her husband Jacob at all in anything. So he's a big mystery. There were no birth records. So it was pretty hard to establish who this family was, who they were related to, how did they get here, all these different things. Sometimes in my searching, I would, type in the Addens name and I would come across a census document. Now, the census documents are pretty helpful. It gives you where the individual lived, who they were living with. Sometimes it listed what they did for work, whether they were educated or not. You can get a whole slew of information from a census record. Well, I would click on it and pull it up, and then it would be blank, except for the names. So some of them, I know you can't read this, but essentially they just have the households listed out. That's on the farthest left 2 columns. And then the names of the individuals that were in that household. And then it'll have their age and then their sex. Now the next column, which is the first blank column in this record, is the race. Now that was a very important factor for me in narrowing my search to make for sure I was looking at the correct people and trying to find the story and make sure the individuals were the same people on the different records. So there is an Addens family in here, and unfortunately we have no idea whether they're related to Chloe or not, or what their story is. Eventually, though, I did stumble upon a Chloe Addens in a census record. This time, it was spelt with an I for the last name instead of an E, and there was a Y at the end of her name, which differed from the Pleasance Book records. This 1850 census from Newtown shows that Chloe lived with the Abraham family, so they are up, their record starts around here, that's the household, and all the Abraham families listed. It normally starts with the head of the family, then the wife, then the children, then any servants or domestic workers, and then normally at the very end, African Americans if they were also present in the household. So you'll see at the very bottom, we have a Chloe Addens. We also have Harriet L. and Jacob. They're presumably her children based on the ages gaps that you can see there. Jacob is also marked as having attended school even that year, so that was interesting to find. And Chloe was 49 at this time in the 1850 census, so matches up pretty well with the 1845 communion list that we have. So that combined with then the internment records and her having children that were buried that were named Harriet, and then her being married to a man named Jacob according to the Pleasance Book, and her son being named Jacob, you can infer that there's a good chance that this is the same individuals that we're talking about here. Unfortunately, after this one record, my path seemed to go dry for quite a while, which was discouraging. I had seen tons of other add-ins. Some were white, some were in a different state, wrong location, the wrong time frame, wrong decades, and I thought I wouldn't get much else. Then I thought, well, if I can't learn more about her family directly, I remembered that she was living with another family, so maybe I can look into them and come across something. So I went back and searched for records for Jonathan P. Abraham, who she was living with, and I had already seen the 1850 census, and there were only a few other documents, so it didn't seem like it was going to be too promising. But I opened up the 1861. It was from Minnesota, and I was thinking, there's really no way that this is going to help me, but it can't hurt to check. So I opened up, I missed the names. Researching all the different names, so people list their names differently, they're spelled wrong. So these are all of the options essentially that I was running through to try and find our Chloe Addens. And unfortunately, there's no real good way to go about it, and everyone transcribes things differently. So all these records that were handwritten are generally transcribed into databases, and so you have a lot of errors in that. And then also with specifically African American families at that time, most of them aren't well educated. A lot of them can't read or write. They may or may not know their birthdays, so they give different dates for their birthdays on different records. So it can be much harder to establish a genealogy or a track of that individual compared to white individuals at the time. So I get to this 1860 record, and there is the same family, everyone listed, and sure enough, right at the bottom is Chloe Addens. So Chloe had moved out to Minnesota with the family that she was living with here in Pennsylvania. There's another census record that I was able to find that I don't have pictured here. It's from a few years before this, 1861, and it shows that Jacob, her son, was also with her. Well, Jacob reappeared back in Pennsylvania in 1860, so presumably he went out there with him and made his way back within 10 years. So that was probably quite the voyage. But at this time, it's only Chloe that's out there with the family. So now going back to the 1850 census, which is in the center, I always glance around to see if there's something else that jumps out. And on this page in particular, I noticed that there was only one other individual that was marked as being African American. So my eye was drawn to that, and I looked across at the name, and I was pretty surprised to see that on the same page of the record was a Mary A. Adams. So we know that Chloe had another daughter who was named Mary Ann, according to the Pleasance book, and we know that Adams and Addins were often used interchangeably. And so I looked at her age-wise, she could have been Chloe's daughter. So again, there's no way to know for sure, but it is plausible that this is the Chloe Addins from St. David's Church's daughter, and that she was just living with another family, working and in a different household. One of the other records that I checked were the poorhouse records from Chester County, and there again, I found some Addins with a different spelling, this time Addins. But it happens to be a Mary Ann Addins, and also a daughter of 13 days named Anna. So now I have a new individual as well. So this got me thinking, I looked at the dates. The poorhouse records are from July 28th, 1851, and Mary Ann was ordered to go to the poorhouse, so the court could actually issue orders to send individuals to the poorhouse. If it's the same Mary Ann as the one we see on the census, she would have gotten pregnant 1 month after the census was completed, and she would have only been 23 at the time that she entered into the poorhouse. Both Mary Ann and her daughter Anna left the poorhouse about a month and a half after entering, and that was the last record I could find of them to date. So while I can't say with 100% certainty that these are the same individuals and that they are the ones that were here at St. David's, it does seem likely. And regardless, it gives us insight as to what life was like for African Americans that were here in the area at that time. We can tell that they moved with the families that they were living with. They were broken up as families. They didn't really stay together, and their circumstances were more challenging. We also, I'm sure y'all can tell now that old records can be extremely hard to research. You have, like I mentioned, the transcription, digitizing errors, what is even available, are they complete, and so much more. The difficulty is only amplified, as mentioned, when you're looking at African Americans specifically, and then again when you're looking to try and find enslaved individuals, because they're not included on majority of these state records. It was only free African Americans that were listed on census information. Names can also change completely. Oftentimes when enslaved men and women were manumitted, they would take on a different last name. Absalom Jones did that and chose the name Jones. So there's all sorts of different things that can happen that make it hard to do this work. Now these records here about the Addins family specifically leave me with some really pressing questions. One of them is, if this is the same Chloe, do we have records that are incorrect on one end or the other? I did find a death certificate from Chloe Addins in Minnesota saying that she died out there. So was the Pleasance book mistaken, because that isn't a primary source, and I had a primary source somewhere else, and they do seem to be the same individual? We don't know. Was she moved back here to be buried after she died by her family? That's also a possibility. Also, who and where is her husband Jacob? She most likely took his last name, and so he's really a key component of the genealogy search as it relates to the Addins family, in terms of tracing back beforehand, and we really have no records of him anywhere. Also, where did Mary Ann go after leaving the poorhouse? Did Anna, her daughter, survive? She was only 13 days old when she entered. And are there descendants of Chloe that we have yet to be discovered? And I think there are. It just takes a lot of research to put all this together, so there's still work to be done. All right, so that concludes my bit about all the different individuals that we're going to talk about. I just want to have this media slide here. So we're not the only ones doing this work. There are churches and organizations across the country that are working to uncover their own stories as well. Additionally, everyone's approach to it is different. So some people are doing education, some people are holding services, remembrance. A lot of organizations are already committed to doing reparations of some form. And so it's really interesting to see what else is going on and what the options are, and to know that we're not on this path alone, and that there's lots of people doing this work, and that it's important work. So where do we go from here? One, we need to continue to research and confirm early members of St. David's that owned enslaved men and women. We need to unveil the stories of the enslaved men and women as best as we can, as well as the free African Americans that were a part of our parish and that are connected to St. David's. We should further analyze and do a better deep dive about the economic impact for our church specifically that can be attributed to the exploitation of enslaved individuals. And this one I think is part of the most important is that we need to make this work publicly available and accessible, properly cited, so everyone can engage with it and interact with it and make it known. Not just do the work and keep it to ourselves, but make sure we're really telling the story and taking those next steps. So I'd like to close this presentation in a moment of prayer and remembrance for all the enslaved persons connected to our church. Please join me for a brief moment of silence, followed by a reading of their names. Betty, Caesar, Deb and her 8-month-old child, George, Glasgow, Jack, Leith, Mary, Nanny, Maul and her 4-year-old son, Quaco, Rachel, Solomon, and all the others whose names we have yet to learn or may never know. May we honor their lives and never forget them. So before I open up to discussion, I would just like to thank specifically Brad, Marianne, and Reverend Emily for all their support, as well as the multiple other individuals who have sat in meetings over this past year and really encouraged me and sent me information to make this presentation happen. And I hope that this is just the beginning of a lot of work that we still have left to do and to share. So with that, I invite anyone to ask questions or partake in discussion.
Samantha, I'll ask. I know you said that some of the enslaved people were buried in the graveyard, and they're an unmarked grave. Do we know where those graves are?
No, so at this time we don't know. I know for certain we have free African Americans buried in the cemetery. I'm not sure about specifically enslaved men and women. But I did look into that, and it's just unmarked is the best we got on that.
Do we know, when you said Chloe moved with the family that she was living with, do the records show that she was enslaved or that she was a worker?
So because she's listed on the census, it would be that she was considered a free African American at that time. Enslaved individuals were not listed on census records at the time.
Sorry. Do we know if the family she lived with, were they parishioners at St. David's, or?
So they didn't come up on my list specifically. I didn't have time to further investigate, but again, that's, uncovering more of the story, figuring out, were they religious? Did they belong to any parish? What denomination? there's lots of questions. But even like the Quakers, who are known and like touted to be general like abolitionists, most of the early Quakers still owned enslaved individuals as well. So it's a pretty complex issue here.
We're just going to do this
I love
all
it.
night.
It's great.
A different row can ask a question.
Well, I just wanted to for the audience, last fall, I don't know what time it is anymore. Leslie, Roy, and I took a tour in Philadelphia, the African American tour, and they talked a lot about Judge William Moore in not a real nice way. So he has a lot of baggage associated with him, and I encourage anyone, it's part of the Constitution Center, and you go to various places in the city, a walking tour, and learn about the history of African Americans in Philadelphia.
I'll take it back. We'll just keep this going. I do know with Judge
Can you
Moore,
put,
at least.
put it closer? Put it closer to your mouth.
Sorry. I had read and seen a document with Judge Moore in that he was the biggest slave owner in the area. Is that what you found as well?
So I have also seen that written. I wouldn't feel comfortable at this time asserting that myself. He's certainly one of the higher end ones that I feel very comfortable saying. But there's a lot of different sources that you'd have to put together to really, I think, make that claim.
And I just want to note he was only a parishioner for a few years.
2 years ago, there was a wonderful movie out about Harriet Tubman, who came from Maryland to Philadelphia. Do we have any records of the people to whom she came, how they helped her, etc.?
So I didn't look into her specifically. There was no major indication that it was related to our parish. So I was really trying to focus here at St. David's, what would hit most to home. But there are interesting things, like in my home research that I found, my property was actually owned by Church of the Crucifixion, so that was the second Episcopalian African-American church opened by Absalom Jones in the city, and they owned it for 70 years. They were the longest owners of that property, and St. David's actually, there are records of St. David's donating to that church. So there are big, broad connections as well, but I really wanted to try and keep this focused and as concrete as we could to what really related to us as St. David's.
Could you say more about the economic impact enslavement had for members of this community?
Sure. This is an area that I think is super important to do additional research on, and it's going to take a lot of time, and it's something that I'm sure will continue. There was not as much about it in this presentation because what we really need to do is look at all of those 1,442 individuals, plus maybe whoever else we have yet to find that were involved in the church back then. We really need to do like deep history dives of their families to figure out what they did and what their life was like early in the days, to be able to tie together that economic impact piece and really paint the picture of how profound that was. As we all know, churches rely on, at the time, subscriptions from individuals, and not only to pay for the missionaries and for the church, but for all sorts of events. And so that money came from the parishioners, and that money then came from however they made it, and oftentimes that was at the benefit of enslaved men and women, and not just here, but also remotely as well. So hopefully we get to a point where we've had the time to put into it and can really pull out those threads and tell that story and give it more of the attention that it deserves in good detail. So I apologize I wasn't able to get that far into it quite yet at this point.
I just wanted to say that Absalom Jones was ordained the first priest at Christ Church in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And there's records of Harriet Tubman attending Christ Church. And I'd be delighted to connect you with the archivist there and dig a little deeper, perhaps, into those two people in their relationship and others that might be related to St. David's.
Great, thank you. Yes. We do know there was a close relationship with Christ Church here. Most of the missionaries came from Christ Church, and oftentimes the families attended both churches depending on where they were at. So.
Samantha, did you contact some of the older missionary churches in the area, not just Episcopal?
I did look at it a little bit. It was a little challenging, but there's definitely room for engagement there, I would say. Some of the churches in the area are doing work. Some aren't. Some are open to collaborating. Some are kind of running their own thing, so.
And some of the other, well, I'm interested, did you contact any of the African American churches? There are a number in Wayne, to see what their records were. If
Yeah.
they have any older records.
I had not specifically done that yet for this project.
And one other question. Did you say that some of the early Quakers did have slaves?
Many of them did.
Many did.
Mm-hmm.
And when did that kind of stop? Do you know?
I don't know exactly. I know it was a big point of contention, but most of them did, and then at some point people drew up of, hey, I don't think this is, Christian and in line with our values. And then they were one of the first groups to really kind of start putting in rules, for lack of a better term. And so one of the first things that they did that predated pretty much all this other work that ended up happening was that you couldn't be an elder of the church if you were a friend, if you owned enslaved individuals. And I believe that was early 1700s, but I'm not positive. Later than that?
1736, the Germantown meeting petitioned the Philadelphia meeting to declare that they were opposed to slavery. And the Philadelphia meeting said, no, we're not opposed. So the controversy went on for a couple more decades.
Yeah. Thank you.
This isn't so germane to St. David's, but have you done research about the Episcopal Church generally and its acceptance and not acceptance of black priests and whatnot?
Yeah, so not specifically in this research project. Anecdotally, I've come across a handful of things. Probably one of the most interesting documents I came across was, I believe it was a thesis from someone for whatever degree they were getting. And they were actually looking at Native American enslaved individuals, so didn't directly relate to us, but that individual had looked at many of the source documents from SPG, and that's where I got the information about the controversy with the missionaries trying to encourage people to bring in their enslaved men and women. And so they did talk a little bit about not just the Native Americans, but also African American enslaved individuals, and that was mainly from like the Eastern Shoreboard where I was getting those letters from. So a lot of like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, talked about Pennsylvania a little bit, but not as much information for down here, but a little overlap there. And then yeah, obviously as we continue to go, my focus was really kind of the early 2 centuries, but this story goes on way past that. So if we go all the way back to the resolution from the General Convention, part of that resolution is not just the, yes, people owned enslaved people and we benefit from it, but it's also the segregation and discrimination and all those other aspects that came after even slavery was outlawed. So my presentation kind of ended at that point, time-wise, and there's obviously still a lot more work we have to do.
Thank you, Samantha, so much. I just want to add one comment, and then we'll still do more questions. A note, which I'm sure you saw too, but it would be helpful probably for everybody else to know, is that in Henry Pleasant's book, he never mentions the word slavery. So while it's a very important document of St. David's history, he does not mention it, acknowledge it. There's never a word enslavement, never a word slavery, only this one reference of a few Negroes. So the whole story is completely missing in one of the documents that we cite as most important of St. David's history. So that there's much work, as Samantha has begun to uncover for us, that we still have to do. So, more questions?
So have you also talked to St. Peter's in the Great Valley, because we shared William Curry, right? Isn't it?
Yeah, we shared a handful of missionaries with
Yeah.
them. Most of the early ones serviced both of the areas. No, I haven't begun to do the overlap yet.
Because I think they have done some research also, so that might be helpful moving forward.
Well, I'd give a plug too for the invitation for all of us who are here to take this the next step. Samantha has done incredible work this last year. She's also actively in the U.S. Army and a young adult who is trying to work. And so she's going to be heading off for a lot of trainings and then actually deployment in this next year. And so the work is still, there's lots of work to be done, hopefully by many more of us in the room that might take this incredible beginning to sort of the next multiple iterations and branches that it really can and needs to go. So that will be my invitation to join the great work of the archives.
Thanks, Reverend Emily. And it is true, there's a lot of, as I mentioned, like I had a huge list, and eventually it was like, I'm not gonna be able to do all of it at once. So I had to pick key individuals to focus in on to tell those stories. So there's lots of opportunity for anyone to go in and pick, again, one individual and really just dive deep on that individual and see what they can uncover. It's a group effort.
Can you tell us why it's so important to you? And I know it's very deep for you, including the property that you're working on. It's something that's very, very important to you.
Yeah.
Can you share that with us, please?
Sure. Yeah, it is really interesting. Reverend Emily talked about how I ended up, me being the person that's giving this presentation right now. And I was doing research on my own property, and Church of the Crucifixion, I mentioned, owned it for 70 years. And they ran it as a summer camp so that the African American boys that were in the city of Philadelphia could get out of the city and experience country life. And it's very cool. There's a handful of their church reports talking about the benefits that was. And it was really something that I had no idea about. And so then I started learning about Absalom Jones. I learned about, how Church of the Crucifixion was founded, and St. Thomas and early church here, and then got connected. And, growing up, never even would have thought about this. I wasn't that interested in history either growing up. But the land that we all live on here even just carries so much weight, and we benefit so much from where we are in our communities. And to just not be acknowledging entire parts of it, entire groups of this community, I think is really just a disservice. And there's a lot of work to be done there, and a lot of justice to be had right here in our own backyards. And we're really fortunate to be able to tangibly do stuff. We're in a situation where we can. We're so fortunate to have this beautiful church here. We've obviously benefited greatly. We have a great parish, and we might as well use it to do some good.